Well, imagine it. The collapse of America by financial meltdown. We are left with nothing but this manual, written by our next guest, giving us instructions on how to survive in a society with no government. It may sound like every anarchist's or disgruntled American's dream, or other people's nightmare. But could we actually function in such a world? Believe it or not, the sci-fi sounding work was written by a former economist for the Federal Reserve, David Barker. The book is called Welcome to Free America. And your premise is that, well, I'll let you say it. What is your premise?
Well, that in the absence of government, society could still function. It would be very difficult to get there. The transition period would probably be chaotic and very bad. But eventually, free market institutions would step up and take over the functions that government does now.
Keep talking.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of easy cases. Think of roads and schools. We can imagine private companies handling those. Would probably do a better job. They might have tolls that vary with the time of day to reduce congestion and all kinds of other innovations that a government monopoly doesn't do. Other things would be more difficult to imagine, such as security. If we had private arbitration, say, instead of courts, people would agree ahead of time which arbitration firm to use, or private security firms that would provide protection for people, and in return, you would agree to follow a list of rules that they had. They would say, we'll protect you as long as you don't violate these rules, right. And if you do.
So let's back up and look at the current apparatus,
sure,
which is a policy-making apparatus, private, public, both,
right,
where power is clearly constantly being breached and corrupted by a relationship between those who are threatened interests, let's say the monopoly health insurance companies, the large monopoly banking system, or it could be a pistachio maker or anybody else, and they have the privilege of being able to send money to policymakers to make sure that the policymakers don't screw up their game. It's like being able to pay money to the government to protect the horse and buggy guys because you're threatened by the car. So even though we've had this revolution in the way we do things, we don't want to do it. In your and again, this is a fantasy that you've portrayed here. I don't mean to overly. How would I prevent the same corruption from occurring, and in fact being even more prevalent? And if you're going to go to private security and private insurance on private roads, isn't that really just a trip to the dark ages? Isn't that just a feudal structure?
Well, the real problem that you're talking about with money in politics, my approach would be to get rid of the politics instead of the money. The real problem is that government has this power to bestow favors on one group or another, and so of course they bid for those favors. We can get rid of that. If we simply take out the money but leave the power, we still have the problem, because favors will still be given to different groups and people will still have, power
sure,
that they shouldn't get. But if we reduce the power of politicians, reduce the power of government, then that becomes less of a problem.
I guess the only thing that sort of gives rise in my head when you say that is there is a tendency for those with power in any environment, whether private, public, money, no money, politics, no politics, to either overly look out for their own self-interest and certainly have a significant undervaluing to the weakest 10%, let's say, of a given group. Thus, we saw Sir Edwin Mallory in the 1400s come up with the King Arthur narrative, because he said, listen, if we don't have a cultural myth of an aspiration to nobility and greatness among the powerful, the knights in our society, they become predators. And the argument for government, which I believe personally has some validity, is that the government is in place to inhibit some of the more predatory natures of power.
Right. Well, two things. I think, first of all, we need competition. Competition tends to mitigate a lot of these problems. That if you have competing forces, that makes it difficult for one of them to have too much
But who
power.
sets the rules of the competition?
Well, competition can be organic, and the rules can develop on their own.
Right. But you still need rules. In other words, you can't play football. We're all enjoying the NFL playoffs right now. I'm personally rooting for the 49ers, if you were wondering. But you can't play a football game without an agreement from the players ahead of time, 10 yards for a first down, 4 downs, don't punch them in the face.
Right, and those agreements can come through negotiation. They can come, through agreements between the parties. But another thing that I think you were hitting on, it's just right, is culture. That a free market system will only work if you have the right culture, just as democracy only works if you have a culture that respects it. Before elections, people would have said, well, that's impossible. The winner of the election will just the loser will just shoot the winner.
Sure.
But we have a culture where that doesn't happen. And this absurd system of deciding power through elections actually works.
Well,
same thing is true with free market.
It doesn't work that way. I've got a lot of folks who will tell you it does. Yes. You know, proportionally, maybe it's better than China, but that's not saying much.
Well, right. That's very true. I think there are inherent problems with any kind of political system and monopoly of power in the hands of government.
Yeah.
But democracy works better than someone might have thought a few hundred years ago. I think markets can work well in a culture that respects and understands how markets work.
And imagine if the democracy hadn't become an actual auction market. We made our political. I'm going to wrap it, but it's interesting.
Right.
It's interesting. If you had markets in the we've actually made the one thing you don't want to have be a market, which is the market for power, a market.
Right. Unfortunately, I think it's inevitable. Whenever you have concentration of power, people will bid for it.
Yeah. No, I hear that. I hope you'll continue to join us. You add a wonderful twist to the debate, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, David Barker, check it out. Welcome to Free America. There's a look.